Good afternoon. Our speaker for this session is Dr. Aparna Bandyopadhyay, Associate Professor of History, Diamond Harbour Women's University, West Bengal. The title of her talk is Women-centric Legislations in Colonial and Contemporary India. Dr. Bandyopadhyay, we now request you to please begin your lecture.
Sorry for the delay. I'm genuinely sorry for joining a few minutes late. Okay, I'll be speaking on the women-centric legislations in colonial and contemporary India. Okay, now, one second. Now, how many of you are from the discipline of history? Now, I see there
I
are
am
quite
from
a.
history. No, I am from history.
Yeah. You
I'm
are
from
Dr. Anjan Shah, I guess.
myself, Aparna Bandyopadhyay, also from history.
Okay.
I am from history, ma'am.
Dr. Aparna Chatterjee from the discipline of history. Department of History, Navagram Hirala.
Okay. So nice to see you all. No, I can't see you, but I can hear you all. And I guess there are several participants from outside Bengal. And I was told so that there are several participants from outside Bengal. Anyway, it's a very rich group. And you are a big number. Nearly 70, I was told, but 40, around 45 have joined till now. I believe some more of you will be joining in the coming minutes, in the forthcoming 2 to 4 minutes. Anyway, let me begin my lecture. Yes, I too am a student of history. I am a teacher of history, and I'm a researcher in women's history. And it's not a coincidence that I recently edited a book along with Bhashwati Chatterjee. The name of the book is Her Story, Essays on Women's History in honor of Professor Geraldine Forbes. As we know that history is popularly referred to as his story. The story of men and their doings, especially in the public domain. History has excluded women. History has silenced women, marginalized women. And so, as historians, we need to retrieve the women who have been lost to history, who have been hidden from history. Now, the phrase hidden from history are borrowed from Sheila Rawbottom. She has a book with that title, Hidden from History. So, my lecture will not exactly try to retrieve women from the abysses of history. Women who have done a lot, have contributed, say, to the freedom struggle, or in the earlier struggles like peasant movements, or say in the context of Europe, say the French Revolution, or say the movement for democracy and civil rights in the West. My lecture will focus on some of the laws that have been passed for the betterment of women's conditions in colonial India and also in post-colonial India. Okay. Now, my discussion of laws will automatically bring these forgotten women within my purview. Okay. So my lecture is essentially an attempt to rewrite history from a feminist perspective and underscore those aspects of the past which have not received scholarly attention till date. Now, the laws that were passed for the betterment of women's condition in colonial India included laws like the law for the abolition of sati, the Act for the abolition of sati, the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act of 1856, and also lesser known acts like the Special Marriage Act of 1872, the Age of Consent Act of 1891, and others. And with regard to the first two acts, the Act for the abolition of sati and the Act and the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act of 1856, historical discussion till date has focused mostly on the role of women on the role of men reformers, on male stalwarts such as Ram Mohan Roy and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. Historical discussion on these acts, discussion that has taken place in mainstream historical scholarship, has not focused on the role of women in in ushering these legislations, and also the arguments that these reformers put forward in support of their legislative endeavors, and finally on the impact that these legislations had on women. Okay. And the later legislations that I have just named, the Special Marriage Act of 1872 and the Age of Consent Act of 1891, especially the Special Marriage Act, has not received historical attention till date and are not really included in the syllabus of our school, college, and university curricula. Now, let me interact with you from the very beginning. I want you to be part of this discussion. I'll be speaking, of course, primarily I will be speaking, but I also want to hear from you all, okay? And I don't want to restrict the discussion to the last half an hour slot of my lecture. We will proceed through interaction. Now, how many of you are aware of the provisions of the Special Marriage Act of 1872? And how many of you are aware of the content of the Age of Consent Act of 1891? I assume that many of you are not from the discipline of history. But you must have heard of the first two legislations that I have mentioned, that is the Act for the Abolition of Sati and the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act of 1856. But the Special Marriage Act of 1872, yes, Pooja, can you briefly discuss this act? The Special Marriage Act of 1872.
मैम स्पेशल मैरिज एक्ट के बारे में तो उतना नहीं, बट एज ऑफ कंसेंट एक्ट के बारे में उसमें बहुत से सारे रिफॉर्मर्स काम कर रहे थे, जिसमें से कादम्बिनी गांगुली ने भी इसमें काफी, डॉक्टर कादम्बिनी गांगुली ने भी इसमें पार्टिसिपेट किया था, और इसके लिए एज ऑफ कंसेंट एक्ट को 12 से 14 कराने की बात की जा रही थी.
Age of consent from
12 to
age
18.
of consent was raised from
12 to 14, I guess.
No,
I think from
the
10 to
1891 legislation I'm
10
talking
to
about.
12. I
From
think
10
age of
to
consent
12.
raised, the age of marriage from 10 to 12.
From 10 to 12. Yes. Right. And what about the others? Has anyone heard of the Special Marriage Act of 1872?
Yes, probably it legalized interreligious marriage.
Yes, it was a
not exactly. Yes, Shuparna.
It was an act which provided for a marriage where both the husband and the wife, the would-be husband and the wife, had to renounce their respective religions, I suppose, where I enter into a secular marriage without going into the Hindu rituals or
the ritual of any religion practiced in India. Yes, you're right.
It is a more or less sort of secular
yes,
organization of a marriage.
Okay. Yes, you're right. Okay. So it's very good that at least 2 or 3 of you are aware of the content of these acts, the later legislations that I am just talked about. But all of you are pretty sure what the Act for the Abolition of Sati intended to do, right? So can anybody briefly tell me what this act was meant for? The Act for the Abolition of Sati? The Act for the Abolition of Sati. Can anybody tell me what this act was meant for?
If I may try, I'm Sonia Bhattacharya speaking.
Yes, Sonia.
Student or MPhil student.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
If I remember, it is probably 1829 ban of Sati, which was promoted by Raja Ram Mohan Roy with William Bentinck, if I'm not mistaken. Lord William Bentinck. And that was also a part of social reform as a legislation for women.
Yes.
But the most biggest irony is that this is just a kind of probably a comment, that social reformers have all been men who had brought in change for women. So I don't know, was it the Bhadralok community or whatever it is? I mean, there are various arguments to it. This is just a kind of a sharing, actually. Thank you, ma'am.
I want to add something. This is
yes,
please.
Yes, please.
Ma'am, I just wanted to add that the abolition of Sati was mainly done on the grounds of the barbarity of the concept as a whole. I mean, the British made the act as such that no woman who is widowed at a young age or at any age couldn't be born on their husband's funeral pyre without her wishes. I mean, even and they and their laws suggested
But
that
if she wished to
if we wish to do that,
commit
she can do
suicide
it.
on her husband's pyre, would the state allow that? Would the British state allow that?
Yes, ma'am, because the British didn't want to interfere in the religions, and all the police stations and the police were told to investigate the matter, whether the sati was done voluntarily or involuntarily, whether there was coercion or not.
But you are okay. You are what's your name, please?
Devopriya Bhattacharya, ma'am. As
Devopriya.
I remember, that was the
You
initial
are
act.
not really correct, because the Act for the Abolition of Sati defines sati as a practice of burning alive of Hindu widows in their husband's funeral pyre, and it declared it an illegal practice and a punishable offense. And even if a woman voluntarily committed sati, voluntarily within quote, this act would say that no woman could commit sati voluntarily. Sati was a practice of burning alive of widows. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So the element of choice, of volition, of consent was just wiped out by this act. And it was Ram Mohan Roy who convinced the British legislators that sati could not be practiced voluntarily. It was plain and simple murder. Okay. And anybody who either forced a woman to commit sati or tried to persuade her in other ways, or anybody who tried to intoxicate the widow, drug her, and then take her to the funeral pyre, would also be considered a criminal. Okay. And it was the duty of police officers and magistrates to ensure that no case of sati happened in the area within their jurisdiction. And they were to be held responsible if such an incident occurred. Okay. So sati was redefined by the act as an act as an act of homicide, as an act of murder, as a criminal offense, and the volition of the widow was completely disregarded. So this was definitely one very good thing that Ram Mohan Roy did. He redefined sati, removed the element of choice or consent from the practice, and persuaded the colonial legislators to see sati as an act of murder. This was a very good thing that he did. Now, let me ask you, what do you think was the motive behind this legislation? The motive of the British legislators, and also why did Ram Mohan Roy take so much trouble to persuade the British to introduce this legislation? In other words, Ram Mohan Roy's arguments in favor of the abolition of sati and the arguments of the British in favor of sati. Now, why did Ram Mohan Roy want to abolish sati? Let us begin with that question. Did Ram Mohan Roy believe that women were human beings as much as men were, and so they had the right to life? Or was it that he believed that women were lesser human beings, objects of compassion or daya, and so he wanted to spare them the pain of death? Now, of course, Ram Mohan was driven by a spirit of humanism. In his treatises, he wrote several treatises against sati, and in his treatises, he refuted the common understanding of women as inherently adulterous, unintelligent, and incapable of self-restraint. He pointed out that since women were denied education, they had little chance to prove their intelligence. He also emphasized the God-fearing nature of women. He also deployed reason evidently he deployed reason to disprove the prevailing misconceptions about women. But with equal vehemence, equal ardor, Ram Mohan Roy proceeded to prove that the practice of sati did not have scriptural sanction. He took a lot of pains to prove that sati had not been endorsed by the Hindu Shastras. So on one hand was the humanistic argument, and on the other hand was the Shastric argument. And if you read his treatises, you cannot help perceiving that the Shastric argument was stronger than the humanistic argument. The Shastric argument, in fact, overshadowed the humanistic argument. Yes. Now, this is one very big question. Why did he take recourse to the Shastras? Now, before I answer this question, let me examine the motives behind the legislative intervention that was made by the British. Why did the British make this legislative move? Now, the British, after becoming the rulers of Bengal and the whole of India, they had become the masters of India, almost the masters of India by the end of the 18th century. And they had made it clear at the same time that they would not intervene in the customs and practices of the indigenous people, of the people of India. And they officially declared in 1773 and again in 1993 that civil matters, that is matters related to marriage, inheritance, maintenance, adoption, would be governed by the prescriptions of the religion concerned. That is, if you are a Hindu, these matters, which were civil matters, would be governed in accordance with Hindu scriptural dictats. And if you are a Muslim, then these matters would be governed by Islamic prescriptions, Islamic prescriptions and dictats. They made this very clear that they would not intervene in the cultural practices of the people they had begun to rule. And why this policy of intervention? Is policy of non-intervention? Because they feared a backlash. Their power, they were still to consolidate their power in India. Their mastery over India, their domination was still in an embryonic state. And they wanted to be more sure of themselves, more sure of their power in India before they intervened. And so this policy of non-intervention, this declared policy of non-intervention. At the same time, the Orientalists, and also which included many who were in the administration, the Orientalists, they took a keen interest in ancient Indian culture and tradition. And at the same time, they critiqued the existing state of affairs, especially the condition of Indian women. While they found a lot of good things in the ancient past, in India's ancient past, a lot to write about, a lot to appreciate in India's ancient past. They were very contemptuous, very scornful about the state of Indian women, as evident to them. I mean, the women who were who lived in their time. They were critical of customs such as sati, early marriage, Colonism, polygamy, etc., etc. And they considered themselves to be the saviors of Indian women. they would wax eloquent on the white man's burden. Now, there are several historians in this group. Could anybody briefly tell me what I mean by the white man's burden? Anjan, Sonia, Aparna?
Yes. Undoubtedly, the British government, to an extent, had been influenced by Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, that this nation was so far governed by some barbaric customs, practices, and usage. And as the Britishers, as the harbingers of modernity, they are to eliminate these practices. This was undoubtedly one of the guiding ideologies of British rule, and certainly they too have been influenced by Christian missionaries as well, who thought that Hinduism had to be demeaned by abolition, by highlighting these practices, which might facilitate the rise of Christianity as a dominant religion.
Absolutely right. Okay. So it was the white man's burden to emancipate India from barbarism, from a very retrograde state of affairs. And what were the markers of this of such a barbaric state of affairs? The very degraded condition of women. Yes, John Stuart Mill had critiqued the condition of Indian women, and but this particular phrase, "white man's burden," was coined by Rudyard Kipling. Okay. So the British considered themselves morally superior, and they thought that they had come. They tried to justify their presence in India, their hegemonic presence in India, by arguing that, look, we belong to a superior civilization, and we have been appointed by God. It is our God ordained responsibility to rescue India from such barbarism, and especially rescue Indian women. So there's a kind of a paradox in the situation, a kind of contradiction in their attitude towards India. In the first place, they did not want to interfere in existing customs and practices. That was their declared policy of non-intervention. But at the same time, they were extremely contemptuous, extremely critical of Indian culture and practices. And they thought it was a duty to rescue India, and especially Indian women. But when it came to introduce a legislation for the abolition of sati, what did the colonial legislators try to prove? Did they say that Indian women are extremely backward and they have to be rescued? No. They iterated the same argument that Ram Mohan was making, that the practice of sati did not have shastric sanction, that it was not endorsed by the Hindu scriptures. Okay. Now, what about the opponents of Ram Mohan, who very who were up in arms against Ram Mohan's move to introduce this legislation? Men like Radhakanto Dev. What were their arguments? The opponents of this legislation, very surprisingly, actually not surprisingly though, harped on the same Shastric argument. The only difference was that they said that sati was endorsed by the Shastras. So ultimately, the matter of contention was sati approved by the Hindu Shastras or not? Ram Mohan Roy took a lot of pains to prove that sati was not approved by the Shastras. The British re-echoed his argument that sati was not endorsed by the Shastras. And the opponents of this reformist move took a lot of pains to prove that sati was endorsed by the Shastras. Now, did anybody care to know, did anybody take any trouble to know what women felt about sati? No. Neither Ram Mohan nor the British nor the opponents of this reformist move cared to know, were interested in knowing what women wanted themselves. Now, you would ask, was it possible at that point of time to know what women felt about sati? Because women were confined within the Andar Mahal, the Zenana, the Antapur. They were all Porda Noshin. They were veiled. And moreover, they were not educated. They could not write. And even if they could write, there was no instrument, no print mechanism through which they could express their arguments. Yes, this is true. But if the British had tried, they could have sought the opinion of women with regard to this legislation. Because one thing that the British had done in the decades preceding the years preceding 1829 was that they would send someone to these places where these burning things, this funeral thing was happening, this practice of burning somebody was happening. And these officials would try to observe the behavior of women who were about to commit sati. They'd also been instructed to ask these women whether they were really willing to commit sati. And if they were not willing, if they said that they were not willing, or if these officials understood, came to understand, guessed that these women were not willing to commit, that they were being forced, then they had been instructed to stop this practice. So British officials were, since the middle of the 1820s, they were actually working on the field, visiting these funeral sites, and trying to observe the ways and doings of these women. So it was not that women were totally inaccessible. But when it came to passing this legislation, they did not bother to, or they were afraid of seeking the opinion of women. I mean, they did not take further trouble in this regard. They were happy to toe the line that Ramon Roy and other reformers were by his side taking, the Shastric line. Now, have you heard of Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's article, Can the Subaltern Speak? It's a famous article, Can the Subaltern Speak?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Very good. So, could anybody tell me in a one or two sentences the gist of this argument? You can just sum up in a nutshell. Gayatri's main argument, Spivak's main argument. Sonia, can you try doing so?
Yes, ma'am, I'll just try, because I have read that long time back, and it was also there in my MPhil the thesis. I think Gayatri Spivak began with, if I'm not mistaken, she wanted to speak about, correct me if I'm wrong, ma'am, I have read it long time back. I think it was to do with the bodies of the women and how the various discourses along with patriarchy, legislation, state, etc., worked on the body of women, and when they can, if they could have challenged with and through their bodies back, if I'm not mistaken.
Right, absolutely. Yes, and in this article, Gayatri mentions this particular legislation and the absence of women's voices in archival records related to this legislation.
May I add
Women's
something?
voice, yes, of course.
Ma'am, along with what Sonia had already said, I just wanted to say, along with the absence of voices, she had also mentioned how these women lacked the agency to put forward their voices and to make themselves heard. Thus, meaning of subaltern is that they are not lower, they are inferior to the other. She had talked about how these women's discourses were ignored and in favor of the dominant male discourses, which are already placed in history's archive, and how these neglected discourses can be put forward if the subaltern were able to speak, but they lack the agency to do so.
Yes.
Ma'am, I would like to say
yes,
something.
Anjan. Yes, please, Anjan.
You have said Britishers didn't bother to take opinions of women folk regarding the abolition of Sati, but was it at all necessary? No, I think no girl, if she is not insane, would like to be burnt alive on her husband's fire. So it may be logically deducted that all women folk would be opposed to such a practice.
So,
I would say that soliciting opinion is not important. I would never say that. But on such an issue, was it at all necessary to solicit opinions?
of course, yes, you've raised a very pertinent point. But let women say that this is murder. I mean, their voices are important, regardless of the issue. I mean, even if the issue is an issue of of sati, which is murder. I mean, murder. Even in this case, the voices of women should have been important to the British, okay, and to the reformers as well. What women really felt about it. I mean, their opinion should have been, sought. That is, that's what feminist historians say. That, of course,
Ma'am,
since this is something that concerns women, it concerns their lives, their existence. Women's opinion should have been sought.
Ma'am, sitting in the 21st century, we can make this argument.
To differ on one point just about the logical thinking. But yes, ma'am, we all know that it was burning alive people with their husbands' funeral. I mean, their widows who were clearly alive. It's very illogical and it's murder. Yes, we all agree on that. I would also agree. But the point is, sometimes I would agree on the point the women should have been left to weren't allowed to speak. Their voices should have been there regarding this. But also there could be another point, because at that point the widows didn't have any rights. Also, if they had lived, the future for them was very grim, because they could only eat only once a day, and all the other superstitions, and they could not have a life, or they could not even remarry. So
yes, this is the point. I understand.
They didn't have a property, so they could have chosen to commit suicide instead of living the whole life of misery which was already ahead of them. It's just a point. May not have been possible, but
no. You're right.
It was the option.
No. You've raised a very pertinent point. Okay.
Ma'am,
so,
I would like to add something. Sitting in the 21st century, making a critique of not soliciting women's opinion might sound relevant. But the reformers and the British rule in 2 centuries back, were they expected or morally attuned to think in this way? Because
no, they were not, and of course they were not. Of course, nobody thought. But if you examine the various initiatives that the British government had taken prior to this passing of this act, you will notice that yes, the British were keen to know whether women were exercising their choice or not in particular instances of sati. But when it came to this legislation, they did not ask their opinion. Okay, no, women were not as voiceless as you assume them to be. And the question of seeking women's opinion does not really sound something, as anachronistic as you think it to be. I mean, it was this endeavor to understand what people feel, what women are seeking, what women, what they want for themselves was to a certain extent important to the British legislators. I mean, it was to a small degree important, but when it came to the passing of the law, they did not ask their opinion, ask the opinion of women. So we can continue with this debate later, but the point that somebody had raised a few minutes back, that point is I think is something a very, very pertinent point. What will women do? What kind of life they will lead after widowhood? And what kind of life did Ram Mohan and other reformers envisage for them? Ram Mohan, in his treatises, made it clear that that widows should practice Nishkam Karma. They should practice Brahmacharya in their widowed existence, and in this way they will attain the bliss that the bliss and this divine approval that previously they would be seeking through death. Okay. So what was the alternative to death on the husband's funeral pyre? The alternative was an existence that was devoid of all physical and material pleasures, and almost an existence that was almost like death. And rightly, you pointed out rightly that many women could have chosen not to lead this death-like existence. Okay. So, of course, we need to appreciate Ramon's endeavors to end sati, but we should also take into mind, we should take into account the fact that Ram Mohan was overwhelmingly obsessed with the Shastras, and secondly, he consigned women to a death-like existence after widowhood. Okay. And with regard to this Daya, and Ronajit Guho in his famous book Daya has highlighted compassion or Daya as the key affective component of Ram Mohan Rai's reformist temperament. But again, Daya or compassion is something that you feel for someone inferior to you. And women should not be seen as inferior, definitely. So I don't think that having Daya for women is a very good thing or something which we need to appreciate. Anyway, now let us move on to the next legislation. Okay, I'll add one concluding sentence with regard to this sati legislation. That in this whole debate on sati, women figured nowhere. Neither the British administrators, nor the Indian reformers, nor the opponents of reform cared to know what women felt about sati, and the humanistic arguments that was very feebly articulated by Ram Mohan and the colonial legislators was overshadowed by the scriptural argument. Now the next act, the next law that we will be discussing is the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act. One second. The Hindu Widows Remarriage Act, which was passed in 1856.
I am interrupting for a second. Shuparna, the participant, will you please put off your video? Shuparna, the participant. Yes, please put off the video. Thank you. I am sorry, Dr. Bandyopadhyay. Please continue.
Okay. Thank you, Mona Lisa. Now, again, the question that I think should be raised is, why did Vidyasagar try to end sati? Why did Vidyasagar to take all the trouble that it took to persuade the British to abolish sati? To introduce widow remarriage. Introduce widow remarriage. Now, Vidyasagar put forward various kinds of arguments in support of a law on widow remarriage. In his first treatise on widow remarriage, Vidyasagar argued that if one solely appealed to reason in order to prove the necessity of widow remarriage, people would not accept it. If one proved that widow remarriage was sanctioned by the Shastras, then widow remarriage had a greater chance of acceptance. He said that the Shastras were the greatest proof that in this country, the Shastras were the greatest proof of the legitimacy of a practice, and hence it was imperative to prove that widow remarriage was validated by the Shastras. Now, Vidyasagar proceeded to quote various ancient texts.
Parashar Sangita, I think.
Parashar Sangita, to find support, in favor of widow remarriage. Now, in his conclusion to his second treatise of widow remarriage, this is very interesting. Vidyasagar's second treatise on widow remarriage, Vidhava Vibaho, one second, his name is Vidhava Vibaho Vishak Ditiyo Pustak. Now, in the second treatise, Vidyasagar asked his countrymen how long would they remain in stupor. He asked them to open their eyes. If they did so, they would notice that their sacred land was being swept by the tide of the sins of adultery and feticide. But he had little expectations from his countrymen. Their minds were so corrupted that the miserable plight of widows would hardly induce their sympathy, and they would feel no hatred for the sins of adultery and feticide. They would allow their widowed daughters to suffer the pangs of widowhood and would condone their sins. They would collude with them in organizing abortions, but they were not interested in abiding by the Shastras and ending this vicious state of affairs. Now, finally, this is very interesting. He writes, you think that after losing their husbands, the bodies of women become stones. They do not lose their sense of grief and pain. Their senses do not disappear. Your decisions are all erroneous. Your nonchalance is having heinous impact on society. Oh, women, what sin drives you to be born in this country? Thus, Vidyasagar had three kinds of arguments in support of widow remarriage. The Shastric argument, the morality argument, and the humanistic argument. He expressed his concern for the predicament of widows, but at the same time, he condemned their affective or sexual relationships with men in their state of widowhood as adultery and sin. In order to prevent further degradation of society and purge it of sin and lift its moral standards, he considered widow remarriage imperative. He appealed to his countrymen to feel both sympathy for widows and hatred for their acts. At the same time, he argued that women had emotions and desires, and these did not vanish after widowhood. And he thus acknowledged widows as human beings. And finally, he quoted extensively from various Shastric texts. Thus, Vidyasagar was constantly shifting the premises of his advocacy of widow remarriage. We can at best say that he was confused. Or was he being strategic? He had to prove that widow remarriage was validated by the Shastras to ultimately drive home the necessity of legislation. But I wonder whether Vidyasagar would have gone ahead with his advocacy of widow remarriage if he had found no support in the Shastras. Now, what do you all say? What is your opinion on this? Why do you think Vidyasagar took so much trouble to introduce remarriage of Hindu widows? What are your perceptions in this regard? I would like to know.
Vidyasagar must have been guided by feeling of compassion as well as logic. And
compassion, yes, again that is our compassion argument.
Compassion as well as logic, and he had to fall back on Shastra because without demonstrating Shastric injunction for widow remarriage, the path to legislation would have been much more difficult, and probably he wouldn't have been successful during his lifetime.
So you think that this whole thing about the Shastras was a strategy?
Yes.
I mean, his emphasis on Shastras was strategic.
It was strategic. He knew well that very few persons would have been guided by logic, compassion, or rationality. So he had to show some Shastric sanction for his legislative endeavor.
But why did he use the word "pap" repeatedly? Was that strategic too? Repeatedly, Vidyasagar is saying, "পাপে নিমজ্জিত হয়ে যাচ্ছে সমাজ, ভ্রূণ হত্যার পাপ, ব্যভিচার ভ্রূণ হত্যার পাপে নিমজ্জিত হয়ে যাচ্ছে." Was that strategic too?
Ma'am, at that point of time, physical intimacy outside marriage was under.
Was it outside marriage? This woman has the widow has lost her husband.
Yes, and if
then I mean, her husband does not exist. She is not being disloyal to anybody. And besides, most of these widows are child widows. They have not cohabited with their husbands. Many of them have not cohabited with their husbands at all. So would you consider that pap or sin?
Certainly,
And could somebody else say?
Yes,
Okay.
I have a point to make here. I think
Yes.
there was this was a ploy to control women's sexuality at this point in time. This is one. And another thing here is that women were made to internalize the fact that if they enter into a physical relationship post the loss of their husbands, it would be a pap, quote unquote.
Of course.
It was not
Yes.
the right thing. So the women being the repositories of culture and religiosity and everything that is supposed to be
Virtue,
good.
honor,
Yes, honor,
blah,
family.
blah, blah.
So I think these are the issues which came in during the
Right.
sort of a legislation, the background to this sort of legislation, to maintain the social equilibrium, the balance within society, Hindu society particularly.
So basically, Vidyasagar wanted to channelize widow sexuality. To divert women's sexual desires to a legitimate channel. I mean, that was basically he wanted to do. He felt threatened. He felt threatened by the sexual desires of widows, and he thought that the sexual desires of widows would lead to a lot of sin in society. And one way of redeeming society from such sin was getting widows married again, married a second time. Okay, so that was the legitimate route that a widow could take for the fulfillment of her sexual desires. Okay. Okay. Now, you must be aware of the various clauses of this act, the act that legalized the remarriage of widows. Now, there were, of course, certain good things that this act brought, certain good things that this act introduced, and also certain things that were not so good. Now, what were some of the good things about this act? Now, of course, it legalized the remarriage of widows and widows of remarriage of Hindu widows. And any widow of any age could remarry. And even if a widow had children, she could remarry. Even if she had cohabited with her first husband for several years, she could remarry. And secondly, this act specifically stated, very clearly, categorically stated, that a Hindu widow's remarriage would be performed in accordance with Hindu rituals. Okay. The rituals applicable to an unmarried woman's marriage would also be applicable to a widow. Widow remarriages were thus treated at par with ordinary marriages. Yes. Thirdly, women of above the age of majority, that is above the age of 18, could remarry on their own choice and did not require the consent of guardians. This was another good thing about this law. Now, according to historian Tonika Shorkar, one of the major beneficial effects of the law was the gradual, I quote from her, a gradual absorption of love and widowhood within the framework of licit romance. Widowhood was translated as biroho, and it was removed from the register of scandal, satire, etc., etc. This is Tonika Sharka's opinion on this act. Now, let me now bring to light some of the glaring loopholes of this act. Are any of you aware of the loopholes of this act? Ajay, somebody is here who has unmuted who's kept her mic on. I can't see her name. So, could you please unmute yourself? Let me see. No, it's now muted. Yes. You are now muted. Can anybody point out the flaws of this act? With regard to the caste dimension of this act, whether it was applicable to upper caste women or lower caste women. Yes, Payal, I will answer your question. I will, of course. But anybody else? Now, the first thing that the act did was to deprive widows who remarried of their right to their first husband's property. Now, under the Daibhag school of law that was prevalent in Bengal, a widow had only limited right to her deceased husband's property. She could not transfer this property to any of her heirs. She could not sell that property to any other person. And moreover, she had to prove that she had been loyal to her husband during his lifetime and even after, in order to lay a claim on his property. But even this very limited right was taken away by this act. This act very categorically stated that once a widow remarries, she will have no right to her husband's property. Secondly, this act deprived widowed mothers who had remarried of the custody of their minor children. Widows who had children, minor children, and who had remarried were not to be given the custody of their minor children. That custody would pass on to her deceased husband's father, mother, brother, and other relatives. The third thing, widows could not remarry. This act said that widows could not remarry without the consent of guardians if they were minor or their marriage was not consummated. They could marry without the consent of their guardians if they had attained the age of majority and their marriages were consummated. No, the linkage between a widow's ability to remarry without the consent of her guardians and the fact of the consummation of her first marriage is not clear to me. If anybody can explain why the two has been linked. The fact that her first marriage has been consummated and the widow's capacity to remarry without the consent of her guardians. Can anybody explain to me the logic of this link up? It means that if a widow who had not cohabited or who had not had any sexual relationship with her husband could not remarry of her own choice, could not remarry without the consent of her guardians. She could remarry only if she was 18 and if her marriage was consummated. I don't understand the logic behind this. Clearly. What has having sexual relationship with your first husband to do with your second marriage, with your ability to choose your own partner for a second marriage, ability to remarry without the consent of your guardians? Now, another big loophole of this act was that yes, the act says that if a widow is above the age of majority and has had a sexual relationship with her first husband, yes, that widow can remarry without the consent of her guardians. But how will she remarry according to Hindu rituals and practices if none of her guardians comes to gift her to the groom? As you know, in Hindu marriage, the ritual of Konnadan is extremely important. And if a marriage is being instituted without the consent of a guardian, Konnadanটা কে করবে সেটা বলা নেই. Even Vidyasagar in his second treatise says, he repeatedly says that in case of the remarriage of a widow, all the norms, all the rituals of the first marriage will be followed, which means that Konnadan has to be followed too. Now, I give an example to you. The poet Radharani Devi, she was Nabonita Devsen's mother. Radharani Devi was not exactly a child widow. She was widowed. She lost her husband in her early adolescence. And she remarried after she was 30. She remarried without the consent of her parental family, her natal family, and without informing her marital family. She was staying with her in-laws before her second marriage. So none of her guardians were present at the marriage ceremony. But though there's also another version that her brother had come, but he had not taken part in the rituals. Anyway, the fact was that the Radharani Devi was marrying without the consent of her guardians. And she was marrying according to Hindu customs. So what did she do to get married, to complete the wedding ceremony? She enacted the ritual of Atto-Sampradan. She gifted herself. She gifted herself to the groom. Okay.
Ma'am, is it allowed as per Hindu custom or scripture?
This wedding created a lot of sensation in contemporary society, and we find several newspaper reports on this, and these newspapers, of course, greeted this ceremony with a lot of approbation, and they liked it. I mean, they considered it a very interesting innovation, and they applauded the couple for taking this move. But I'm not sure whether, I don't know. I mean, I have not come across any instance of Sampradan in the ancient Hindu texts. But I may be wrong. But one thing I definitely is very clear, that Atto-Sampradan was something new in the 1930s. It was unheard of in the 1930s, and Radharani Devi was taking a revolutionary move by gifting herself to her bridegroom. Okay. But whether it had precedence in ancient India, I'm not really in a position to say that. Now, the final critique about this act. This act was meant for widows, all Hindu widows, irrespective of caste. But the fact was that widow remarriage was taboo among the upper castes, but not a taboo among the lower castes. In fact, widows of the lower castes had customary rights of remarriage, and moreover, they had the right to inherit their first husband's property in case of a second marriage. However, once this law was passed, lower caste widows, of course, they continued to remarry, and custom was reinforced by law. Law validated their customary right to remarry, but at the same time, lower caste widows who remarried were deprived of their right to inherit their first husband's property. Their customary rights were just steamrolled and crushed by the British judiciary. The British judiciary clearly upheld the norms of Brahmanical Hinduism and imposed these on lower caste women whose lives had hitherto been governed by customary law. actually this legislation led to the Brahmanization of the lower caste, the imposition, not exactly Brahmanization of the lower caste, I would say the imposition of Brahmanical patriarchy on the lower caste. And this has been pointed out by Lucy Carroll and also Shomita Sen. Okay. Yes, now Payal Roy, could you unmute yourself and ask me your question directly?
Yes, sure, ma'am. Yes. So my question is, as far as I know about the Widow Remarriage Act, it is directed to address the issue of remarriage of upper class Hindu women. So my question is that, I mean, does it only talk about the upper class Hindu women, or does it also talk about upper class?
The law does not specify the caste of women. It says, I'll read out from the text. I mean, the bare text of the law. No marriage contracted between Hindus shall be invalid, and the issue of no such marriage shall be illegitimate by reason of the woman having been previously married or betrothed to another person who was dead at the time of such marriage. Any custom and any interpretation of Hindu law to the contrary notwithstanding. The law applies to all Hindu widows, irrespective of caste. But the unfortunate thing was that lower caste widows already enjoyed customary rights of remarriage, and moreover, they could remarry and also enjoy the property of their first husbands. But this law, while validating their right to remarry, took away their right to their first husband's property. Okay. So the law dealt a blow to custom, to the customary rights that lower caste women had traditionally enjoyed. Okay. Now let us move on to the third act. Now, I see a number of comments in the comment box. Onjun has written, well, that it allows me to. Yes, Onjun, what have you written? Let me see. This presentation enables me to analyze some known facts from a different angle. Thanks a lot, ma'am. Shobita Chaudhary rightly said, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Onjun. We can have a discussion after this lecture. I'm already beyond my schedule. I mean, it's already 4:30 and I have not yet begun my third law, which is the Special Marriage Act of 1872. Now, the Special Marriage Act of 1872 was passed, was in response to an appeal for a law legitimizing Brahmo marriages made by Keshav Chandra Sen. Okay, but when the final version of the act, when the law was finally passed, I mean, the British published several drafts of this act and sought the opinion of the public on this act, on the various drafts. The final version of the act was not validation. I mean, did not validate Brahmo marriage, but it upheld a secular contractual form of marriage between men and women who were ready to disavow their religious identity. Okay. Men and women who were prepared to declare that, yes, I am not a Hindu, I am not a Christian, I am not a Muslim, I am not a Buddhist or a Zoroastrian, etc., etc. This act laid down certain terms and conditions. In the first place, the parties intending to marry must not have a husband or wife living at the time of marriage. In other words, this act ruled out polygamy. Now, this act fixed the age, the minimum age of marriage for both bride and groom. The bridegroom must be 18 and the bride must be 14 years of age. Each party must obtain the consent of guardian if he or she has not completed the age of 21. However, this act said that widows could remarry without the consent of guardians. But the minimum age of marriage fixed was 14 for women and 18 for men. Okay. And there were other clauses such as that you cannot marry within your, within your kinship group, and there should not be any blood relationship between the parties. So incest was ruled out, incestual marriages were ruled out. Now the merits of this act, very clear. No, another very important thing, another important proviso of this act was that this act legalized divorce. It said that the Indian Divorce Act shall apply to all marriages contracted under the act, and any such marriage may be declared null or void, null or dissolved, and further dissolved if it is, dissolved in according to the clauses of this Indian Divorce Act. In other words, parties marrying according to this act gained the right to divorce. So marriage was no longer a sacrament. Marriage was transformed into a contractual event. It was to be completely secular. There would be no religious ritual in this marriage, and moreover, the parties to this marriage would have to declare that they had no association with any of the religions practiced in India at that time. Okay. And of course, there was no stipulation with regard to caste and community, and so this act fostered intercaste, inter-community marriages, it fostered love marriages, it fostered marriages above the age of 21. It fostered marriages without the consent of guardians if the woman was a widow, or if the men and women were above the age of 21. Okay. Now, the demerits of this act are hard to find. I mean, most of them, this act was was something that that has to be praised. There are few loopholes that you can find about this act, and if the if the act is applied, then the very idea of marriage will be transformed. But unfortunately, this act had few takers. The idea behind this act was revolutionary. And of course, the act had the potential to revolutionize the institution of marriage. But the applicability of this act was very limited in that context, because only a handful of persons were ready to deny their affiliation to any religion. Okay. And so this act proved to be a failure. It's not that nobody married according to this act. Yes, there were a few marriages held according to this act, but the number were too few. I mean, very few people married according to this act. And so this act had to be amended in 1923. And Hindus were brought within the purview of this act. Okay. And this amendment was introduced by Hari Singh Gaur, who was a member of the Legislative Assembly, and it is also known as the Gaur Act. And it brought Hindus within the purview of this act, because this act had fallen through. Nobody was marrying. Very few people were marrying according to this act, because nobody was ready to say, I'm not a Hindu. Even Brahmos, even Brahmos, only a few Brahmos would say that I'm not a Hindu. Most Brahmos would not say so. I mean, they believed that they were better Hindus, but they were not ready to say, I am not a Hindu. A very difficult declaration, almost an impossible declaration. And so this act fell through despite its revolutionary potential. Okay. Now, let me come to the final legislation of the 19th century. The Age of Consent Act of 1891. The Age of Consent Act of 1891 was also known as Act 10 of 1891, and it was an amendment of the Indian Penal Code, which was introduced in 1860, and also an amendment of the Code of Criminal Procedure, Section 375, 1882. And this act raised the age of consent for sexual intercourse for all girls, married or unmarried, from 10 to 12 years in all jurisdictions. Its violation subject to criminal prosecution as rape. Now, the Act for the Abolition of Sati and the Hindu Widows Remarriage Act, both these laws applied to Hindus only. The third act that I had discussed applied to all those men and women who were ready to dissociate themselves from any religious identity, dissociate themselves from any religion practiced in their time. The fourth act was applicable to women of all religions. And it was applicable to both married and unmarried women. And it was a criminal law. The Indian Penal Code was a text that defined, categorized criminal offences and also stated the kind of punishment that these offences, these offences would entail. The Act for the Abolition of Sati was also a criminal act. It talked of punishment to those who had aided and abetted in the act of Sati. The Widow Remarriage Act was not a criminal act. It was an enabling act. It only permitted widow remarriage. The third act had no criminal, implications. And the final law of this century, of the long 19th century, was a criminal act. And the very idea of age of consent was linked to a grave offense against women, a very serious offense against women, rape.
Ma'am, are you referring to Horimaiti case?
Of course. But I'm talking right now of the Indian Penal Code section 375,
yes.
which deals with rape.
Rape, yes.
Okay. And the idea of consent to sexual intercourse was linked to this definition of rape. What is rape? Rape is an act of sexual intercourse perpetrated against a woman without her consent. And rape is also an act of sexual intercourse perpetrated by a husband against his wife below the age of consent, which was 10 according to the original Indian Penal Code. The consent of the wife in this case is immaterial. Even if the wife gives consent, the husband's act of sexual intercourse will be considered rape if the wife is below the age of 10. Okay. Now that age was raised to 12 in 1891. And of course, you were right. What had triggered this movement for an enhanced age of consent? The Harimohan Maiti and Pulmoni Maiti case. This case, which had occurred in 1889 in Bengal, an 11-year-old Bengali girl named Pulmoni Maiti was grievously injured on account of forced intercourse by her husband, Harimohan Maiti. Harimohan Maiti was a much older man. He was probably around 35 or something. Now, technically, Pulmoni Maiti was above the minimum age of consent, the age of consent. She was 11 years old. And the age of consent stipulated by the Indian Penal Code was 10. So Harimohan Maiti could not be incriminated on charges of rape because the girl was above the age of consent. However, Pulmoni was not the only girl to die on account of forced or painful sexual intercourse inflicted by a much older husband. If you scan the newspapers of this time, there are instances galore of women unsuccessfully fighting their lives against gruesome, torturous incidents of sexual intercourse. But no Bengali reformer came forward to ask for an enhanced age of intercourse, age of consent to sexual intercourse. A Parsi, a Bombay-based Parsi journalist named Behramji Malabari appealed to the government, campaigned against child marriage, against and asked for a hike for an enhancement in the age of consent. And finally, the age of consent was raised from 10 to 12 by an amendment of Section 375 of the Indian Penal Code in 1891. Now, what were the good things about this act? That this act applied to all women, irrespective of their community affiliation. It applied to all women, married and unmarried. But let me ask you, what was this whole hullabaloo about consent? Were the British legislators at all bothered about the consent of women to sexual intercourse? Were the reformers at all bothered about the consent of women to sexual intercourse? And who asked for asks for a married woman's consent to sexual intercourse? Do their husbands ask for their consent? Do the families care about the women's consent? Nobody cared about women's consent. Even in this day, today, very few people care about women's consent. Actually, nobody was bothered about women's consent but they were using the word consent. And once they use the word consent, we tend to expect a lot from them. We think that they are actually asking women to decide whether to have sex or not. They are giving importance to women's choice, her ability to withhold consent. No. Consent was actually a euphemism for the preparedness of the woman's body to face sexual intercourse without injury. Initially, it was thought that at the age of 10, women's bodies were prepared to face sexual intercourse. But when these incidents, these gruesome incidents of injury and death began to be reported in the media, then people began to think that the age should be raised. No, it's not 10, it should be 12. At 12, women's bodies were a little more mature enough to face sexual intercourse. So it was not the mind, but the body. And the body's preparedness for sexual intercourse That was the issue at stake. Okay. Now, I think it's time to conclude, but I still have a lot to say. I mean, initially I had proposed to focus on post-independence legislations as well, but I've been too ambitious. It appears that I had been over ambitious. No. So I restrict myself to these colonial legislations. Now, one thing about this Age of Consent Act, which needs to be highlighted, is the fact that women were remarkably vociferous about this act. Not just Maratha women, not just Marathi women. Marathi women, they launched an agitation. In fact, they launched a movement for an enhancement of the age of consent. They wrote series of petitions to the British government asking for a rise in the age of consent. But also Bengali women and even Muslim women, Bengali Hindu, Brahmo and Muslim women, and also Muslim men. We tend to focus more on the Hindu revivalist backlash against the Age of Consent Act. But we tend to ignore the fact that a section of the Brahmo Samaj had welcomed the act, and also a section of Muslim society had welcomed this act, and women across community, across religion, asked for an enhancement of the age of consent. And it's very interesting to know that one of the first beneficiaries, one of the first few women who had availed this legal instrument to penalize their husbands or sons-in-law were Muslim women. And they were not even educated urban Muslim women. They were poor Muslim women residing in the villages, but they had availed this legal instrument to correct the injustice that had been done to their wives, to their daughters, or to themselves. Okay. So now I'll conclude with just one small statement about Vidyasagar's take on the age of consent issue. Now, Vidyasagar was not in favor of an enhancement of the age of consent. The act was passed only a few months before his death, and he did not welcome this act. Okay. He believed that the sanctity of Hindu religion, religious customs and practices would be jeopardized on account of this act. So I end here today. I've spoken a lot. I wanted to hear more from your end, but there is still some time, around 5 minutes. So I'll stop here and I'll ask you to ask me questions. If you have any question, please feel free to ask me.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
So can we say that Vidyasagar was a bit self-contradictory? He had welcomed intervention of the colonial state regarding widow remarriage, but regarding enhancement of age of consent, he was opposed to it.
Yes.
So,
Vidyasagar had a lot of contradictions, a lot of ambivalence.
probably everybody has, but Vidyasagar too.
Everybody has, yes, yes. Ramon, I mean, we can say the same thing about Ramon. We can say the same thing about Vidyasagar. We can say the same thing about Rabindranath Tagore or Gandhi or any.
Everybody else. Yes.
Yes, everybody. Yes. So, yes.
Hi.
File. Yes.
Yes. Ma'am, it's not quite clear that why Vidyasagar would oppose that the act of age of consent. I mean, how would that jeopardize the Hindu culture?
I mean, he felt that if the act was introduced, it would. I mean, that was the Hindu revivalist argument against the age of consent, that the sanctity of Hindu marriage would be jeopardized, and this whole ritual of Garbhodan, it would be at stake. Now, what was this ritual of Garbhodan? This ritual made it mandatory for a woman to offer her womb to her husband within 15 days after the onset of her first menstruation. Okay. Now, suppose a woman starts menstruating at the age of 11. So she has to consummate her marriage within 15 days. But if this act is passed, then I mean, this Garbhodan will not be possible. I mean, if people choose to abide by the law, then this Garbhodan will be will not be able to be. I mean, the practice, the ritual of Garbhodan will just fall through. I mean.
Okay, but
he believed that, I mean, he and many others believe that that women should be allowed to cohabit with their husbands immediately after their first menstruation, and that menstruation could start at the age of 10, it could start at the age of 11, or it could start anytime. I mean, it can start very well before the age of 12. That was their argument.
Was there no law that would sanction a marriage of women after 12?
No. So please don't confuse the age of consent with the age of marriage.
Yes. But it would just make sense that you would pass a law that would...
no, the law regulating the age of marriage was passed in 1929. The Child Marriage Restraint Act, and it was supposed to apply to all Hindus, Muslims, and all other communities, and it fixed the age of minimum age of marriage for girls at 14. Okay, and before that, there had been no legislation to fix the minimum age of marriage for girls or for men. The Special Marriage Act had done so, but the Special Marriage Act was applicable only to those who were ready to say, I'm not a Hindu, I'm not a Muslim, etc. And nobody was ready to say so. Okay, so the first legislative initiative to regulate the age of Hindu women was taken in 1929. Okay. But in 1891, hundreds and thousands of girls were still being married off at the age of 8 or 9, which was called the age of Gauridan. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, any other question or comment or observation? Now, if you want a reading list for social reform for these legislations, I will send the organizers a list, and the organizers may circulate it among you. Okay.
Yeah, ma'am, please do that.
Yes, of course, I'll do it.
Okay.
I have some of my own articles on these social reform legislations, and I will also send you the names of articles by other scholars. Okay. Thank you, Shuparna. Thank you, Shobita.
Thank you,
Thank
madam.
you, Mona Lisa.
Yes, Aparna. Thank you, madam, for this most enlightening lecture, as the comments in the text box are also showing you. And indeed, as a participant said, this lecture has helped us to think about colonial legislation in more thought-provoking ways. Thank you so much. We thank our participants, and
thank you, Sonia. Yeah, yes, yes, Mona Lisa. Continue,
yes.
please. Yeah.
And we look forward to our participants joining us tomorrow for the third day of this workshop at 11 a.m. Thank you once again, Aparna, for a wonderful, wonderful session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye. Bye, everybody.